You know his words will get you farther than the film will ever go. Give him a moment of your time, he'll tell you what's wrong with the show. He knows what's good, what's bad, what's really bad. His face is just a sign. Say hello to Confused Matthew.
This is the second children's film I've reviewed on this channel. Because of this, many of you, particularly Incredibles fans, may have been thinking the same thing. Oh no, this isn't going to be another Lion King review, is it? Well, no, The Incredibles wasn't that bad. In fact, I want to repeat that for all the Incredibles fans out there. The Incredibles wasn't that bad. In fact, let me make myself perfectly clear on a few things before we begin. None of the protagonists in this film were an asshole, there were no gaping plot holes, at least none that I could detect, the story was well paced, there was always something going on in the plot, and there was certainly enough in this film to pull you through to the end. In other words, there wasn't anything about The Incredibles that necessarily made it a bad film per se. So why the hell am I reviewing this film, you may ask? Because whether The Incredibles was good or bad, I didn't think anything good came of this film. What possible good could come from watching people suffer through so many horrible things? This review is going to be very different from every review I've done so far. Usually, I only review films where every element has a problem that goes to the core of what makes it work until the film is left totally unsalvageable. But that isn't the case here. I only had one problem with this film. But it was a big problem. The Incredibles made my list for a very rare reason. Everything in the film seemed to be working fine, but one consistent flaw completely overshadowed any good that may have been there for me. That's what makes this review different. Not only am I just telling you how I feel about the film rather than what's wrong with it this time, but I'm also not trying to convince anyone that this film was bad. What I'm trying to convince you of is that it was cynical, depressing, and terribly, terribly mean-spirited. And for me, that was enough to ruin all the other elements of the film. And each of my viewers will just have to decide if they agree. So our film opens to a few superheroes being interviewed about the job of superheroing. This includes Frozone, Elastigirl, and our main protagonist, Mr. Incredible. I liked all of these characters immediately. We then cut to a typical day in the life of Mr. Incredible, helping little old ladies, saving cats from trees, and stopping criminals in their tracks. After this, he gets a call about a robbery in progress, and is just about to respond when he notices a kid in his car. Turns out this kid is the kind of fanboy celebrities only ever have nightmares about. He made himself a superhero suit, and is now imposing himself upon Mr. Incredible to help him fight crime as Incrediboy. Mr. Incredible tells him that he's been very nice and very patient up to this point. He's signed his autographs, posed for his photos, but this is crossing the line. However, no matter how reasonable he tries to be, the kid still persists until eventually Mr. Incredible just hits the kid's ejector seat and takes off. Good for him. Probably would have done the same thing myself. So Mr. Incredible eventually makes it to the scene of the crime and is about to apprehend the suspect when Elastigirl beats him to it. She begins flirting with him, and these two then share some witty banter before she eventually leaves. So Mr. Incredible handcuffs the suspect and leaves him for the police when he notices a man about to fall off a building. He catches him, and they end up in another building where a villain just happens to be. So Mr. Incredible is about to deal with him when all of a sudden the insufferable little kid shows up again. Once again, Mr. Incredible tries to be reasonable, but the kid just won't stop. He tells him that he's always saying you should be true to yourself, but that he never says which part of yourself to be true to, which is a really crappy and unfair position to be putting Mr. Incredible in. If you ask me, this kid just needs therapy. So try as he may, Mr. Incredible still cannot seem to talk sense into him, and finally the kid says that he'll go for help when the villain plants a bomb on him. So Mr. Incredible saves the kid, but accidentally knocks out a train track in the process, forcing him to stop the oncoming train the hard way. After all of this is wrapped up, he sends Buddy, the psychotic fanboy, home in a police car, and tells the officers to make sure his parents know what he's been up to. After hearing himself be addressed as Buddy, the kid promptly responds, "My name is Incrediboy," to which Mr. Incredible responds, "You're not affiliated with me." Hilarious. Anyway, eventually Mr. Incredible makes it to a church, and we learn that he and Elastigirl are getting married. After this, we roll into a montage of events that will set the stage for what this film will ultimately be about. It turns out many of the events Mr. Incredible participated in that night resulted in lawsuits that eventually led to the superhero community being forced into permanent hiding. One of those incidents was the train he stopped. Turns out many people on board the train were injured in the process. Now, in my opinion, just this one event would have sufficed for the purposes of this setup, but there's another incident thrown in here that actually really offended me. It turns out the man he saved from falling off of a building is also suing him. Why? Because he wasn't falling off the building, he jumped because he was trying to commit suicide. Suicide? Suicide. There's a suicide joke in a children's film. I was really taken aback by this the first time I saw it. I mean, how is this appropriate for a children's film? Mr. Incredible even informs the man that he saved his life, and the man responds, "You didn't save my life, you ruined my death." I mean, for God's sake. Some of you may say I'm overreacting to this, but I don't think so. Suicide is a serious subject, and for the most part, belongs in a serious movie. It certainly does not belong in a children's movie, particularly if it's done for laughs. So then the film jumps 15 years into the future. All the superheroes are now in hiding, and Mr. Incredible has been reduced to this. Take a good look at the look on his face there, because this look will reflect the tone this film will have pretty much for the rest of the time. Mr. Incredible is now a claims adjuster. Ugh, what a horrible fate. He's stuffed in a cubicle like Milton from Office Space, and his job pretty much forces him to use every technicality in the book to deny people their claims. However, what we get here from this scene is an indication of the kind of man Mr. Incredible is. Even with personal risk to his job, he informs his client of a few loopholes she can use to get her claim approved, which pisses his boss off something awful. This shows us that no matter where he is or what kind of job he's doing, Mr. Incredible will always find a way to help people. Unlike a lot of the later Disney installments, this character trait feels natural and intrinsic to the character. Nothing about this feels forced or artificial. So after this, we cut to a scene of Elastigirl being called down to a school, and we are then introduced to Dash. I liked this character too. Hang on, some of you may be saying at this point. Isn't Dash an obstinate little brat who isn't listening to anyone and putting tacks in his teacher's chair like an asshole? Aren't those the kinds of qualities that you despised so much in the character Simba? No, absolutely not, and I'll tell you why. Just like Mr. Incredible's clinical depression at work, Dash's behavior is not intrinsic, it's circumstantial. His circumstances are causing him to act out in ways that he otherwise wouldn't. Dash is like an animal that's left in a cage all day. What he needs is a good outlet, and he wants a good outlet. He wants to act out in a positive way by going out for sports, he just can't, because unfortunately for all of them, the world is keeping the superheroes down at this point. Dash is a genuinely good kid who is having a bad time of it at the moment. Simba was just a dickhead. Anyway, after giving Dash a talking to, they then go and pick up the daughter Violet. I liked her character too. Finally, Mr. Incredible returns home after a depressing day at work and messes his car up in the process. This turns out to be the straw that broke the camel's back, as he gets so frustrated that he's about ready to chuck the car across the street. Geez, cut this guy a break, why don't you? Then at the dinner table, every horrible circumstance that is forced onto these good people, Mr. Incredible's horrible job, Dash is being forced to being something he's not, Violet feeling literally invisible, and Elastigirl trying desperately to keep her family together under these circumstances, finally erupt into a fight. Now, from an artistic point of view, this scene was very well done. Firstly, the whole thing sounds natural. You never get the sense that this is coming from a script. This really is the way families fight, and this is probably the way they'd fight if they just happened to have superpowers. But from an audience point of view, I don't want to see this family fight. I like this family a lot. If I hated them all, it would be easier. I could just laugh at their plight. But since the writers have gone out of their way to make a great cast of characters, I just wanted the movie to hurry up and make things better for them. So far, the film has given the characters a lot of things to do and a lot of situations to be in. And none of them have been good. Welcome to part 2. So after the big family fight, Frozone comes for a visit, and he and Mr. Incredible go to what they say is their bowling night. In reality, it turns out that they are secretly heroing without their family's knowledge. This outing turns out fruitful but risky, and then Mr. Incredible returns home only to be caught by his wife. So after the last fight, Mr. Incredible returns home to have yet another family fight, and that makes us realize that the only time he's ever spent with his family so far has been under hostile circumstances. Once again, this fight sounds natural and unscripted, and once again, I don't really want to see these characters fight. I mean, when exactly do we get to the good stuff here? So the next day, Mr. Incredible goes to work and is told he needs to go see his boss. The insufferable bureaucrat begins lecturing him about how he's helping too many people when Mr. Incredible notices someone about to be mugged. He tries to go and help him when the boss starts treating him in an undignified manner, talking to him like he's a kid trying to go out late. The mugger gets away, and Mr. Incredible gets so frustrated that he strangles his boss and chucks him through 5 walls. His satisfaction is short, however, as he now realizes that he's out of the job. So, not only is his family life in a state of discontent, but now he can't even afford to support them anymore, must suffer the indignity of being unemployed, and they may even have to be uprooted and relocated once again. Are you having fun yet, kids? So Mr. Incredible returns home to figure out what to do when he notices a strange folder. The folder contains a message from a strange woman who wants to recruit him for superhero work and will pay him a substantial sum. Thinking the deal over, Mr. Incredible then looks at his memory wall and ponders how wonderful it would be to be a superhero again. And this begins the problem with most of the second act. Mr. Incredible is essentially going through a midlife crisis here, remembering the glory days and trying to relive them. This is essentially the same as a 40-something buying an old sports car and the like. We know it's making him temporarily happy, but for us, it's just kinda sad to watch him go through this. But he eventually does and accepts the job. His first assignment is to stop a giant robot that's tear-assing through an island. Now, for bravity's sake, he does, and then begins to work for these people on a permanent basis, all the while making his wife believe that he has simply been promoted at work. Now, I meant it when I said that none of the characters in this film are an asshole. They're not. Just like Dash, Mr. Incredible is a good man who is having a bad time of it at the moment. Now, that may go far in explaining his behavior here, but it doesn't quite excuse the fact that he's lying to his wife on a daily basis. To make this fact worse, we then roll into a montage of Mr. Incredible interacting with his family in a positive way, and the family becoming happier and happier as a result. Which would have been exactly what I was hoping for if it weren't all under false pretenses. Lies upon lies that are giving them the false illusion of happiness. The monkey wrench that's thrown into this montage is that we know it won't last. We know that he can't keep the lies up forever, and eventually his family is going to figure it out, and the house of cards will come crashing down. This scene ultimately does nothing but set itself up to fail. So after a few weeks on the job, Mr. Incredible is about ready to meet the man in charge of this whole operation, and lo and behold, we learn that the whole job was a ruse created by an older version of Buddy, the psychotic fanboy, who has now become a superhero/villain, Syndrome. Now, let me comment on this character for a bit, because for me, this was another big hurdle to get over in order to enjoy this film. I know we're not supposed to like this character, but I didn't enjoy or appreciate a single moment of his presence. Syndrome is so cruel, so sadistic, and so unapologetically mean that every scene he's in is just off-putting. If I may make a comparison to one of my favorite villains from a children's film, Gaston. Boorish, egotistical, singing songs about how great he is. I love to hate Gaston. I don't love to hate Syndrome, I just hate him. So Syndrome begins monologuing his evil plot to Mr. Incredible. He plans to make a robot that only he can beat and unleash it on the city, then he will stop the robot on his own and be welcomed as a hero. After this explanation, he tries to kill Mr. Incredible, but he gets away. After navigating his way around the island for a while, Mr. Incredible eventually makes it to Syndrome's control center, where he learns that most of his superhero friends have been horribly, horribly murdered. Are you having fun yet, kids? He's just about to leave when he eventually gets found and recaptured. Meanwhile, Elastigirl is going through her daily routine when she gets contacted by Edna Mode. I loved this character. Turns out Mr. Incredible needed his suit patched up, but not only did Edna make him a whole new suit, but she just assumed the whole family needed suits too. So she brings Elastigirl down and demonstrates how all of them work, and then we reach the House of Cards tumbling down as Elastigirl realizes that her husband has been lying to her the whole time, which causes her to start sobbing uncontrollably. This movie is eventually going to be enjoyable, right? She locates her husband by activating the tracking device built into his suit and decides to confront him. After borrowing a jet from a friend, she gets underway, but lo and behold, the kids snuck aboard the plane as well. And now we get to what is probably the worst part of this whole film. Syndrome detects the jet coming towards the island, and his first response is to start torturing Mr. Incredible. Yes, torturing him. In a children's film. Mr. Incredible insists that he doesn't know where the plane came from when they suddenly hear Elastigirl over the radio. As soon as he realizes someone Mr. Incredible cares about is on the plane, Syndrome fires 2 short-range missiles at it. Now, usually when something bothers me about a movie, I know almost immediately what it is. This scene did bother me the first time I saw it, but in all honesty, I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was that bothered me about it until the second or third viewing. And here it is. There is nothing comical or cartoonish about this situation, like for example in Lilo and Stitch, where the guns they used were like little squirt guns that weren't really hurting anyone. These are real missiles headed towards a real airplane with real women and children inside. That's not fun or exciting, that's just terrible. Mr. Incredible pleads for his wife's life, but that does nothing to deter Syndrome. Then as the scene goes on, Elastigirl reports that his children are on board the plane too, which also does nothing to deter Syndrome. You know, I think this might be the first children's film where I honestly felt the antagonist deserved to die. So in this scene, which is not entertaining as much as it is stressful, Elastigirl is dealing with the fact that her and her 2 children are about to die, Mr. Incredible is dealing with the fact that his whole family is about to die, and after a demand from her mother, Violet suddenly has the lives of her family thrown onto her shoulders. Are you having fun yet, kids? Eventually the plane does get blown up, but the family is saved by Elastigirl. However, on the other side of this scene, Mr. Incredible is hanging his head low and feels worse than he has ever felt in his life. Why? Because he heard a plane blow up with his whole family in it, and he thinks they're dead. I want to repeat that for the writers of this film that didn't really seem to get that. Mr. Incredible hangs his head low and feels worse than he has ever felt in his life because he heard a plane blow up with his whole family in it and he thinks they're dead. Once again, this isn't fun or exciting, this is just terrible. Mr. Incredible doesn't deserve this. No one deserves this. Have you ever had a moment in your life where your family's plane was delayed or they were late coming back from somewhere and you had that horrible thought in the back of your mind that something terrible might have happened to them? Well, that feeling is just a taste of what Mr. Incredible has to endure for the rest of the second act. Now, granted, he's off camera all of that time, but in the back of our minds, every moment we don't see Mr. Incredible is just one more moment he's mourning the loss of his whole family. And to make this worse, Syndrome, who knows his loved ones have been murdered by him, does nothing but mock his pain. This makes Mr. Incredible so blind with grief that he captures Syndrome's henchman and threatens to kill her. Syndrome challenges him to do just that, but Mr. Incredible just can't bring himself to do it, which causes Syndrome to tell him that even when he has nothing to lose, he's still weak. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This film is eventually going to be enjoyable, right? Welcome to part 3. So the family eventually makes it to the island, and Elastigirl decides to track down her husband while leaving the children in a cave. As if she was doing my job for me in explaining the negative aspects of this film, she tells them both that the villains here are not like the villains on their TV shows. They won't show mercy because they're children. They will kill them if they get the chance. How remarkably fun, pleasant, and magical. Now, on a positive note, they do rebound on one negative part of the last scene. Violet apologizes for not being able to put a force field around the plane when her mother needed her to, and Elastigirl tells her that it wasn't her fault, that it was wrong of her to put so much pressure on her, and that when she's ready, she will know what to do. It doesn't quite make up for the horrible position we had to watch Violet in the last scene, but at least they aren't just letting it hang in midair. So after putting Violet in charge, she then sets off to find Mr. Incredible. She ends up at the center he's being held in and begins a covert sneaking operation, which is actually fun to watch rather than just being stressful. Meanwhile, the kids are hanging around the cave when they are suddenly in danger of being horribly burned to death, but eventually escape. Turns out the exhaust from a rocket was propelled into the cave. The rocket contains an unstoppable robot that is headed towards the city at this very moment. So as Mr. Incredible is still mourning the loss of his whole family, Syndrome's henchman releases him and tries to help him escape. Turns out his show of mercy towards her has caused her to switch sides. However, Mr. Incredible grabs her by the throat and says to her, "How can you possibly bring me lower? What more can you take away from me?" Why, it's like he's saying exactly what I was thinking. Dear God. Someone please just shoot this poor guy and put him out of his misery. However, the henchman informs him that his family survived the missiles and are now on their way to the island. This makes Mr. Incredible relieved and ecstatic and takes a lot of the pressure off the audience in the process. We then find Elastigirl has reached the center and is remarkably angry with Mr. Incredible, but he couldn't care less. He's just happy to see her alive. Meanwhile, the kids wake to find a strange bird looking at them, which turns out to be a security system. The kids almost get captured when Dash remembers his mom's advice to run away as fast as he can if trouble arises. This leads into a chase scene that was very exciting, but still gets bogged down in a great deal of stress as Dash is literally running for his life. He eventually gets away and is reunited with the rest of the Incredibles, and these characters finally overcome their problems and come together as a family. By hurting people together. This fight lasts for a bit until finally Syndrome breaks the whole thing up and captures them all. He leaves them in restraining devices and heads for the city where he can stop the robot. The family takes a moment to reconcile a lot of the issues they've been having until finally escaping with the help of Syndrome's henchmen, and they manage to get back to the city in a flying Winnebago, all the while exchanging dialogue that's right out of a road trip picture, which makes this scene one of the few in this film that was actually lighthearted and charming. They eventually reach the city and realize that Syndrome has lost control of the robot. By working together as a family, they manage to retrieve the remote control device he lost and bring the robot down, saving the whole city. But we're not done yet. A bit later, they get a call from the babysitter of little Jack thanking them for the substitute sitter. As the family didn't hire a substitute sitter, they all rush home to find Syndrome holding the baby. He tells them that he plans to kidnap the kid and raise him to be villainous like him, to twist and mold him into a fiendish sidekick. Syndrome almost gets away with this when it is revealed that the baby has morphing powers and begins kicking his ass. So the baby gets saved by Elastigirl, and Syndrome, having not heard Edna's informative speech on the importance of no capes, gets his cape caught in the jet turbines of his ship and gets chopped to shreds. As my fellow reviewer SF Debris is so fond of saying, too good for him, I say. So Syndrome had the opportunity to warp, twist, and corrupt a small child, but ultimately never went through with it. So he wasn't quite as evil as Timon and Pumbaa, but close. So finally, we get to the one and only moment where the family can feel something other than pain. Dash gets to go out for sports, Violet feels more self-confident, and apparently the family is allowed to superhero again. Unfortunately, this moment is the very ending of the film. This movie was 115 minutes, and the only good that ever really came out of it were literally in about the last 2. So here's my closing statement. This movie was not good for kids, but it was responsibly and appropriately rated PG. So that's fine, but it still doesn't change the fact that we have a movie that's bad for kids, but also targeted at kids. It's not the first time this has happened, to be sure. It just seems to be one of the first times no one noticed it was happening. The movie didn't really have much in the way of serious problems. All the things I've discussed in this review are nothing more than stumbling blocks. They're either going to bother you or they aren't. If they didn't bother you and you actually liked this film, I couldn't really have anything against that. I just don't understand what I was supposed to enjoy about this film. If The Incredibles was bad, it wasn't bad like a bad movie. It was bad like seeing a suffering animal on the side of the road that you either want to turn away from in disgust or have put out of its misery. They had a great cast of characters, and the idea was really good too. They could have built any story they wanted around this premise, and I just don't understand why they decided to take it in the depressing direction that they did. Now I have to say, I'm usually not a big fan of sequels when it comes to standalone films, but I would actually really love to see a sequel to this film. Now that all the horrible dark times are over for this family, maybe they can put these characters in a film that I would actually enjoy watching. The end.